So last week, I failed to move the scriptures, as you'll recall. I went back and watched the video afterwards, and we never had the scriptures up on the screen, and so I have been fired from that role. And since I was fired, I forgot to bring my PC, which we were using to bring in the sound. So I will be fired from bringing my own PC as well. So you in Zoom land, you have me to blame, and I'm so sorry, but we can't hear you. So we're going to have all the reading done today. So we have finished the third missionary journey of Paul, and we are now into his years of imprisonment. And if you recall, he had a desire to go to Rome. He would take gifts to Jerusalem first, and then he would head to Rome, and then ultimately to Spain. But the theme of the whole book is really Jerusalem to Rome, how the gospel spread from Jerusalem to Rome. So last week, we saw that he had come back from the third missionary journey and landed at Tyre in a ship. He had 7 days there while the ship had to be reloaded and worked, and he found some disciples, and it says that the disciples, through the Spirit, urged him not to go to Jerusalem. Now, by the way, all the way through this, he says, in every city, the Spirit testifies to me that I will be subject to afflictions and imprisonment. He knows what's going to happen. There are those people that say that these people were speaking for the Holy Spirit and that he shouldn't have gone. And there are those who believe this is God's divine providence and he was supposed to go. But what he ultimately said was, it's these chains that are the furtherance of the gospel. So it was because he was imprisoned. I believe the Holy Spirit knew that he was going to be imprisoned, and God worked through him to do this. And so at Tyre, they urge him not to go, and he says farewell, and he heads to Caesarea. And at Caesarea, you remember, he stayed with the evangelist Philip. Philip was one of the 7 deacons who was friends with Stephen, who was stoned. And Paul was consenting to his death, and he stayed with him. He had 4 daughters that were prophetesses, and this prophet named Agabus comes to him and takes his belt and in a very dramatic fashion binds up his arms, binds his waist, and says, the man who owns this belt will thus be bound by the Jews when he goes to Jerusalem and handed over to the Gentiles. And then it says, we all urged him, we, being Luke and everybody in the house, urged him not to go to Jerusalem. And they were weeping and crying. And Paul said, why are you weeping and crying? Why are you doing this? I know what's going to happen, and I am willing to be imprisoned, and I am willing to die in Jerusalem for Jesus. And so he heads to Jerusalem. And when he gets there, he meets James and the apostles, James, the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus, who is leading the church. He meets with them. They glorify God that he's brought a gift and all of the things that's happened with the Gentiles, but they say, you know, there are thousands of Jews in this town, thousands of Jews who are confused by what you're doing. Because what they're hearing is you're saying forsake the law of Moses. And so we've got 4 guys that are going to an oath in the temple right now. You need to go purify yourselves, join up with them. And at the end of their purification period, at the end of their oath, you need to pay for their sacrifices. You need to cut your hair with them. You need to be the sponsor. And so about that, so he's inside the temple operating on this oath, and some Jews from Asia. Now, Asia was a province where Ephesus was. And you'll recall they ran him out of town. They had the massive riot in the theater. And so they come from Asia and they say, this man brought in a Gentile into the intersection or into the temple and defiled it, because they had seen a man named Trophimus who was wandering around Jerusalem, and they assumed that Paul had taken him inside the temple, which was a violent sin, which defiled the temple. The Gentiles go crazy, the Jews go crazy at this moment. They drag him out. They close the gates because they know that they're about to beat him and they don't want blood. They don't want the blood of Paul to defile the temple. And they're beating him. And all of a sudden, from the Antonia fortress, which we'll see a map of today of the temple, the Romans who hate riots come out and they save him and they arrest him. And they say, are you an Egyptian? are you the Egyptian assassin that we've heard about that causes all these riots? And he said, no, I'm a Jew from Tarsus. Would you allow me to do something? Will you allow me to speak to these people? And so it says there was a great hush. You could have heard a pin drop as he gives his testimony. It was a perfect model for how we should give our testimony. This is who I was before I was saved. This is how Christ changed me, and this is how God is working in my life. And so he starts out and he says, look, I was an Orthodox Jew. I was a Pharisee. I grew up at the feet of Gamaliel. I crucified both men and women for the sake of the Jews. And that's who I was. And then he talked about how Jesus saved him, how he was on the road to Damascus and this giant light came out of the sky and a voice said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I'm Jesus Christ who you're persecuting. Now go to this man named Ananias. Now don't confuse this Ananias with the Ananias we're going to have today. But go to this man named Ananias and he will tell you what to do. So he goes to Ananias and Ananias comes to him and says, Brother Saul, he calls him brother, so that these Jews, as they're hearing the story, will know that this Jew called him a brother. He said, your sight is restored, rise up and be baptized. And so that is what happened. That's how he was converted. And then he goes into how God's working in his life. And he says, so I was at night in the temple and God came to me in a trance. And he said, get out of Jerusalem. And all these people are just listening to him as he's talking about God coming to him in a trance and telling him to get out. And he argues with God and says, but I told God, these people saw me crucify people, saw me persecute Christians. They know that I was there consenting to Stephen's death. They're not going to do anything. And he said, you need to get out now because I'm going to send you as a witness to everyone, including the Jews and the Gentiles. I'm going to send you to everyone, including the Gentiles. And it says, up until this word, Gentiles, they were quiet. And when they heard the word Gentiles, they went totally nuts. And that brings us to today.
And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they had stretched out him for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned? When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen. So the tribune came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, yes. And the tribune answered, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. Paul said, but I am a citizen by birth. So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune was also afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the councils to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them.
How do you think it's going to go with the Sanhedrin? Swimmingly, I'm sure. So the tribune, again, of the cohort, as is used here, is the commander of the garrison. And his name is Claudius Lysias, which we'll learn more about him later on in the lesson. But Claudius, like all Roman commanders, is charged with one thing, and that is to keep the peace, to keep everything down. He doesn't understand what's going on. First of all, this speech that Paul makes is in Aramaic. And Claudius Lysias, he doesn't know Aramaic. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't hear him say anything about being from Tarsus. All he knows is that the way that we're going to figure out what the real story is we're going to beat you. We're going to scourge you. This word flogging means scourging, and it's the same word that was used with Jesus. This is the cat of nine tails, the flagellum, that would have bones and metal tied into leather on a rod, and they would beat. It would literally strip off the flesh on the skin and eat into the muscles, and they were going to beat him beat him without charging him. By the way, he wasn't even supposed to be chained. They're going to beat him and tear his skin off until he tells them what's going on. And he says in verse 25, in a respectful way, is it lawful for you to scourge a Roman citizen? He obviously knows it's not lawful to scourge a Roman citizen. And so the tribune, Claudius, comes to him and says, are you a Roman citizen? Now, by the way, Claudius at this moment is afraid because he is not only bound him, but he almost scourged him. And he is going to claim credit for saving Paul later on with Governor Felix. But right now, he is afraid. And he's like, you know, I had to buy my citizenship for a large sum. And Paul says, no, I was a citizen from birth, which would have been more respected, from Tarsus, which is one of the top 3 cities in modern day Greece, basically, the Greek Empire. And so this Claudius Lysias would have bought his citizenship from Emperor Claudius, who was the emperor from 41 AD to 54 AD. And this emperor was willing to actually let people buy citizenship. So anyway, by the way, he probably got his name, Claudius Lysias, from the name Claudius the emperor. And so it says down in verse 29 that the tribune, the commander, was afraid because not only was he about to scourge him, he had him in chains. And I talked about in Philippians how Paul said that it's these chains that are not a detriment to the gospel, but it's for the furtherance of the gospel. And he will be in chains most of the rest of his life, even though at times that he is going to be in house arrest, most of the rest of his life he'll be in chains. So verse 30, but on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him, and he brought the chief priests and all the council to him, and he brought Paul down. So we'll see a map in a second. Keep in mind, Claudius is with the 10th Legion in the Antonia fortress, which is connected to the Temple Mount. And then on the other side of the Temple Mount, but within the Temple Mount, is the Hall of the Sanhedrin. And so he's got in the Antonia fortress, in barracks, he has Paul. And he brings the Sanhedrin and the chief priest over to the Antonia fortress, and he brings Paul down. So this is not a normal meeting of the Sanhedrin. These guys have just been summoned into the Antonia fortress, and that will begin to play a role in the next section. Tammy?
Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. At this, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Those who were standing near Paul said, you dare to insult God's high priest? Paul replied, brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I stand on trial today because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. There was such a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome."
So there are no great biblical truths. Well, to me, there were no great biblical truths in chapter 23. It's a story, to me, almost about God's providence. It's a story about how God moved in Paul's life and how he accomplished great things. There's a lot of meat, though, behind this particular section, and I'm going to double click on this first section, and we'll take a little bit of time. And then through the rest of the chapter, we'll move pretty fast. But Paul, Paul is there in this Antonia fortress, and he looks intently at it. He's just looking. There's 70 members of the Sanhedrin, plus the chief priest, plus Ananias, who is the high priest. And so you've got, 80 people that are standing here in this trial, and he's looking intently at all of them. And he says, brothers. Now, normally, when they would have addressed the Sanhedrin, he would have said fathers and brothers, elders. He would have treated them with respect. In some version, it says men and brothers. I think NASB, which is a very accurate translation, says men and brethren. And so he is treating them like equals. There are those who believe that Paul may have actually sat on the Sanhedrin prior to his conversion on the Damascus Road. And he would have been looking at these people not as elders, not as fathers, but he was looking at them as peers. And since they would have been the same age at this point, it's possible that literally some of these people that are on the Sanhedrin may have been his classmates with Gamaliel. And so he is treating them like equals. And he says, I have always lived my life in good conscience up to this point. So he consented to the stoning of Stephen. He didn't say he lived a sinless life, but he said, everything I've done, I've lived in good conscience. And what he is saying is, I never intentionally went against God's will. When I was doing what I did to Stephen, I was doing it in my own good conscience. And it took God to shape me and move in my life and change me in a way that he wanted me to operate. And then I began to operate in good conscience in that way. And he moved me. And Paul is, you can just sense as he's saying this to the Sanhedrin, he's getting ready to give his testimony again. And the high priest orders someone to smack him in the mouth. And he says, the high priest is Ananias. And he said, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. I love this, right? This is a very human response. This is exactly how I would respond. Do you remember when Jesus was on trial in front of the Sanhedrin? And one of the police of the Sanhedrin struck Jesus in the mouth as he was talking. What did Jesus say? Jesus said, why do you hit me in the mouth? If I said something wrong, correct me. Paul didn't do that. Paul's acting like Russell Freeman. Paul is saying, you whitewashed wall. And it goes back to, there are multiple references to whitewashing in the Bible. Jesus accused the Sanhedrin of being whitewashed tombs, which is dead bags of bones in a tomb that's been whitewashed. And Ezekiel made a reference to ugly walls with whitewashed plaster as he talked about the false prophets, people that are ugly or dead on the inside that have been whitewashed and are something on the outside. This Ananias is not the high priest that was the Ananias, or excuse me, that was the high priest in John that we studied about with Jesus. Don't confuse this Ananias with Ananias and Sapphira. Don't confuse it with Ananias in Damascus. This Ananias was a Sadducee, and he was very evil. Josephus said that he actually stole tithes from the other priests. He was highly wealthy and he was most hated. The Jews tried to revolt. There was a huge revolt around 66 AD against the Romans. Ultimately, that revolt led in 70 AD to the destruction of the temple. And so he was high priest up until 66 AD, and he was killed in the revolt, not by the Romans, but by the Jews. That's how much this guy was hated. And so this Ananias is striking Paul on the mouth, and Paul is saying, "You whitewashed wall." And then they said, "Do you revile our leader?" And he said, "I didn't know who he was." And there's multiple theories about what he's doing here. I don't think he knew Ananias. I think that he had come into the Antonia fortress. There's 80 guys there. And this wasn't a normal meeting of the Sanhedrin. They weren't in their robes. The high priest wouldn't have been in his garb. And I just think he didn't know who he was, and he's truly apologetic for saying something disrespectful to a ruler. And this is a concept that he espouses throughout the New Testament, that we're supposed to honor our rulers, and that's why I believe that. Now, there are people who believe that he just couldn't see. You remember I've talked about when he was struck on the road to Damascus with this light, and there are people who believe that may have affected his eyesight because he was blind. You remember it was Lystra or Derbe, he was stoned, and there were those, and he was apparently dead, and there were those that believed that maybe that impacted his eyesight. And as he is there trying to make out these 80 people, he can't see. In Galatians, he said, when I was there, you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me as a replacement. And then in Galatians 6, as he's finishing, he takes over the writing and he says, see what large letters I write with. So they think maybe it was an eyesight issue, but I don't think so. I just think he didn't know who he was. And so as he espouses this view of honoring the rulers, that's something that applies for us today. And depending on whether you're a Republican or Democrat, that may be particularly hard today, right? I will say this, past presidents are no longer rulers. So Obama, if you want to run him down, you can run him down now. That's a joke. I'm just kidding. You shouldn't do that. And so Paul now sees what the state of play is, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And I've talked about those before. There were four basic sects at this time, SECT. There were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and then there were the Essenes. The Essenes were the guys that lived way down south, and they were in the community that had the Dead Sea Scrolls. Qumran, perfect, Qumran caves. And so the Essenes were there, and then there was a group called the Zealots who were nationalists and wanted to overthrow the government, and they were largely behind the revolt in 66. So these Pharisees and Sadducees come into existence sometime between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They're not referenced anywhere in the Old Testament, and you see right down here that the Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection or angels or spirits. They don't believe in any heaven after earth, but they were heavily influenced by the Hellenist input. They liked the robes, they liked the Greek names. In fact, Ananias is a Sadducee. Ananias was not a Pharisee. The Pharisees formed sometime close to the captivity in 586 AD in Babylon. And that's when they first formed synagogues where people would study in small groups. And the Pharisees were given to deep study of the law, and then they were also given to oral law. So as oral law was passed down, we talk about the Mishnah and the Gemara and what they have today, that's basically the written down form of oral law. The Sadducees didn't believe in that at all. They didn't believe in all, they believed in the first 5 books, and that's all there is. They don't believe in all this hokey pokey, ultra conservative stuff of the Sadducees. Yes.
What made up the Sanhedrin?
No, so in the Zoom world, the question is what made up the Sanhedrin? And so it was a blend of Sadducees and Pharisees. And at this point in history, Ananias would have actually been appointed by the Roman government. And so if we go back to the story of Jesus, the high priest was Annas at the time, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. And the Romans had appointed Caiaphas as the high priest, but all the Jews still looked at Annas. And so in this particular case, Ananias is appointed by the Roman government. And so anyway, Paul decides to fight with something very unique, which is wisdom. And he knows that he can get them spun up. And he says, you know, I'm in prison over 2 things, hope and resurrection. And both of those, in his mind's eye, are the Messiah. And these Pharisees hear this resurrection and they're like, hey, we agree with this guy. This guy, I mean, what if he did see an angel? He's saying exactly what I believe. And this is such a human response that, I mean, if somebody agrees with us, they're the smartest person in the world. And so that's what they're saying. I mean, we find nothing wrong in him. I mean, what could you find wrong? And so, and they see what's about to happen, that the dissension in verse 10 becomes so violent that Claudius is seeing what's happening with all of this argument. Again, Claudius is all about organization and no rioting and no dissension and just peace. His job is peace, or he'll be put to death if he loses control of his people. And so he takes them to the barracks. Do you remember the story of Peter in Acts when he's in these barracks? What happened? He was chained up on each side. And remember what happened? The angel came and the chains fall off. They lead him out the gate and he knocks on the door and the girl comes down and she's so excited she runs back up and doesn't let him in. Remember that? That doesn't happen to Paul. Why doesn't that happen to Paul? When I talk about the providence of God, have I told you the story of Carolyn and I first meeting? Do you want to tell this or should I? My version. She said, just know that my version is not true. So there I was. I'm sitting in accounting 2 at Texas Tech, first day of class. She sees me and she comes. I could tell by the way she was looking at me. She sees me and she comes down and sits right beside me. Yes, of course, this is a huge, there's like 250 seats. And well, what are the odds of that, right? So we know where she's going. And my buddy who's sitting beside me, he said, hey, she is the Marion kind. She's not the Dayton kind, so don't look at her. And I'm like, what does that mean? I'm kind of interested in both. And so that's the story I tell. She saw me. We didn't say a word to each other the whole year. But the truth is, and I'll straighten up the story. Y'all forget this last part. The truth is, her friend had been saving her seat, and I came and sit down beside her saved seat. That's the providence of God. All these little things that happen in life happen for a reason. There's a mastermind that is weaving every single thing together. Catherine.
Well, I was going to say, because he said, I'm a Roman citizen by birth. So where he was born ended up being extremely important in saving him. And that his father was a Pharisee ended up being very important now. So all of those things all work together for him to where he is right now.
Right. So if you didn't hear that in the Zoom world, Catherine is saying that God began working prior to his birth in his father's home place and being born a citizen and being born a Pharisee and studying at Gamaliel, and how God had worked in all those things to save him so that he could actually accomplish his purpose. And that is the providence of God. So God is working in him in a way he didn't work in Peter. He's working in him in these chains that are going to be for the furtherance of the gospel. And Jesus comes to him. I tried to count. I think there are 6 times that God comes to him. And almost everyone is in a time of crisis. When he came to him on the road to Damascus, Paul is on a tear to persecute the church. And then he came to him in chapter 16. Paul says later, if you remember when he was at Troas, he had tried to turn north and he had tried to turn south, and it says the Holy Spirit stopped him. And he doesn't know what to do, and he's frustrated. And a Macedonian man comes to him in a dream. Paul later says that it was the Lord telling him what to do to go to Macedonia, but he was highly frustrated at the time. And then in Ephesus, as they're throwing the fit, you remember the riots, he gets kicked out of the hall of Tyrannus, he is kicked out of the synagogue, and he's got to be frustrated. And Jesus comes to him and he says, be of good cheer, for there are many people in this city that are my people. And then we have him coming here in this very instant and saying, take courage, which would have been over the next several years. He basically said, take courage because you've testified, you've told the exact thing I wanted you to tell. Take courage. What a great source of encouragement. And then the last time happens when he's on a boat and they're in the middle of a storm, and God comes to him and he said, take heart, everybody's going to survive. And so God is coming to him. Notice it says the following night, the Lord stood beside him. So he has this thing with the Sanhedrin. They're in an uproar. He's locked in chains that night, all the next day, and it's the following night when God comes to him. He must have been working himself into a frenzy, and God saw what was happening, and he comes and says, take heart. And you know, there's nothing more big than just the words, the Lord stood by him. And he stands by all of us. He is always present. Okay, Jeff.
When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to tell you, or to say to you. The tribune took him by the hand and going aside, asked him privately, what is it that you have to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, tell no one that you have informed me of these things.
So this is probably one of the oaths like God made with Abraham. And you remember in the Old Testament where they split the animals in two. God had made a covenant with Abraham, and he comes to him in the middle of the night, and you see this fire pot going through these animals. And it was the kind of oath that was something that kings would do. It's basically saying, let these split animals, let this happen to me if I don't honor this covenant with you, Abraham. And so this is the kind of oath that these people are making. They're basically saying, let me die if I don't kill him. I'm not going to eat or drink. Let me die if I don't accomplish this oath. And so they basically concoct this thing. There's 40 of them who have this conspiracy. One little Paul. Paul is little. If you remember, there's a writing that describes Paul, and I'll forget this, but he was short, he was bow-legged, he was bald, he had a unibrow, and it said he had the face of grace. It was written by a historian in Corinth. And so this little, bald, bow-legged, unibrowed guy is going to be killed by 40 people. And now the son of Paul's sister. Did anybody know Paul had a sister? No one knows Paul has a sister. Did anyone know Paul has a nephew? And do we know anything about him? No. This is it. Paul sends his nephew. He says, go do this. Now, you know, there are these Christian groups now that believe that if you have cancer or you or are sick or some way, you should not render medical care because you should leave it all to God. Paul didn't leave it all to God. Paul said, hey, go tell the commander right now. By the way, if you get sick, go to a doctor. And so Paul is taking extraordinary measures, and he calls one of the centurions. So he is a prominent Roman citizen, and he's got the authority to actually summon one of the centurions, and the centurion asks him. The tribune, who is Claudius, takes him by the hand, and so you get this image of this young boy being scared in front of the commander. It says that he was a youth, so we don't know if he was 9, 17, whatever. But Claudius takes him by the hand and he believes him. And he probably believes him because he knows Ananias. If you can scroll down to the picture, Doug. In the upper left-hand corner of the temple, that is the Antonia fortress. That was built by Herod the Great. Again, that housed the 10th Legion. And along this wall facing us on the top would have been the hall of the Sanhedrin. And so that's where the 70 would meet along with the chief priest and the high priest, and they would have council. So somewhere between the Antonia fortress, they are asking for Paul to be released, and he is either going to be murdered on the temple wall as they walk to the Sanhedrin, or they're going to take him outside the temple wall and they're going to murder him in the streets. And so they're lying in wait, and now Claudius knows what's going on.
Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter to this effect. Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against this man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him.
Over 470 men are now guarding them from these 40 guys. So now Paul is on horseback, bald, unibrow, short, bow-legged, and he's got 470 guards watching over him as 40 men are trying to kill him. And they go at the 3rd hour of the night, which is 9 p.m. And it takes you back to the days of Damascus when they lowered him out the wall in a basket. And so he is escaping in the dark of night with this great, great courage. And Claudius Lysias realizes that these enemies are not going to stop at anything. If they're going to murder him against their law and against Roman law without a trial, they're not going to stop at anything. And so his only solution, if he's going to keep the peace, if he's going to keep the section of Jews and the Jewish Christians and the Jewish non-believers at peace, he's going to have to get him out. And he's going to have to set up a proper trial. And so he writes this letter to Emperor Felix, Governor Felix. Governor Felix is the procurator of the Judean province, and he replaced Pilate. And so Felix, by the way, Felix was himself a slave. He is the only recorded slave that ever rose to the position of governor. And he was not highly regarded. There are writings that say that he ruled with the power of a king, but he had the instincts of a slave. And so they were demeaning him. And he writes this letter, and he's very proud of himself. This man was seized by the Jews. He announces that this is Claudius Lysias, politely references Felix. And he says, I came upon them with the soldiers. He's a citizen, and I rescued him. Did he say I almost scourged him and I bound him? No, that doesn't. I learned he was a Roman citizen, and I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, which is theology. And he says exactly what Pontius, his predecessor, or what Felix's predecessor said, which is, I find no fault in him. I see nothing in this that deserves death. And so he sends him before you so that they can stand, the accusers will come before you so that they can state what they have wrong, what they have complained about, because this man deserves a hearing is what they're saying. Okay, let me just read the last section. So the soldiers, Acts 23:31, so the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day, they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. And when they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Antipatris is still there today. We didn't visit when I was there, so I don't have any great pictures, but it ended up becoming a Roman crusader place. It was a logical place to stop. It was 37 miles from Jerusalem, and it would have been a safe distance from the 40 assassins that were going to kill him. And so they take part of the troops back to Jerusalem, and the remainder go all the way to Caesarea. We've seen Caesarea numerous times. If you remember, Caesarea was the first Roman centurion that Peter witnessed to. He was called. Caesarea is where Paul has just come back from in the house of Philip. Caesarea was the government seat of Judea. It was built by Herod the Great. This is, when they say Herod's praetorium, this is where he would have been. And so you see a map there right in the middle where Antipatris is. And if you can go down, Doug, to the next picture. This is modern day Caesarea. You can see a structure out on that little peninsula, and that is where Herod's praetorium was. So this is not, he is in the praetorium, he is in Herod's place. This is not a heavy burden on him at this point. Even if he's bound, he is in a great place right on the ocean, and if you have to be in prison, that's where you want to be. And it says in verse 34, on reading the letter, Felix asked what province he was from. And so there was the opportunity in certain sections of the Roman world, there were two different rulers. And had this been one of, and those rulers in certain circumstances could request their citizens to be held on trial in their province. So he wants to know where he's from. Cilicia is not one of those provinces. And so he says, okay, I can try you. And so at this, I'll give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in the praetorium. So we will continue on in chapter 24 next week. There's a possibility we may accelerate a little bit into chapter 25, or I may do both. Acts is a great story. It's a really, really great story.